before Charles comes up, I'm also a member of the faculty at the Graduate Center, and one of the reasons we want to hold this event together was to give some of our undergraduates here at Baruch, some of you who are political science majors, a little taste of what the faculty is like up at the Graduate Center, in case you ever might think about, which I would encourage, doing some graduate work and continuing your studies in political science. So hopefully today is an interesting sort of taste of the graduate program at about 34th Street.
So I'm Charles Tien. I'm also at the Graduate Center, and I'd like to thank David for hosting us today. I also want to thank Allison Cole. She's not here, but she's the executive officer at the Grad Center. And so it's a jointly sponsored event between Baruch College and the Graduate Center, the political science departments of both of these institutions. And it's great to see so many people here. The event today is about what happened last night and what we expect to see going forward. As you know, the midterm elections happened last night. Votes are still being counted today. And we have a great panel to help us make sense of what did happen and what we can expect in the next 2 years. And I'm going to briefly introduce each of our distinguished panel members, and then they will each talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we're going to leave the last 45 minutes or so of the day for questions. So I would urge you, if you do have questions, to kind of hold them to the end of all of our presentations, and then we'll try to get to all of your questions. So on the far right there is Professor Michael Fortner, and he studies the intersection of American political development and political philosophy, particularly in the areas of race, ethnicity, and class, all important issues that came to play in last night's election. He is the author of Black Silent Majority, the Rockefeller Drug Laws, and the Politics of Punishment, published in 2015 with Harvard University Press. This was the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and winner of the New York Academy of History's Herbert Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in New York History. He's also edited another volume on city politics called Urban Citizenship and American Democracy. And his articles have appeared in Studies in American Political Development, the Journal of Urban History, and the Journal of Policy History and Urban Affairs Review. David Jones, which most of you know since he's the chair of the department here. He is a professor of political science at Baruch and at the Graduate Center. His research is on Congress, political parties, and elections. And he has published these works in several scholarly journals. He's also the author of Political Parties and Policy Gridlock in American Government, and co-author of Americans, Congress, and Democratic Responsiveness. He has regularly served as an exit poll analyst for various news outlets, including last night at CBS News. Peter Liberman is also a professor of political science at Queens College and the Graduate Center. His specialty is international relations, and he teaches courses in security studies and international politics. He's currently working on a book on retribution and public support for state violence and political decision-making. He has published numerous articles on this subject in International Organization, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Public Opinion Quarterly, and Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. His earlier research addressed nuclear proliferation and the political economy of security. And this included a book on military occupations titled Does Conquest Pay? The Exploitation of Occupied Industrial Societies. Kina Lipsitz is, I guess, on her way, and she'll be joining the panel. She's a professor at Queens College as well as the Graduate Center, and her expertise is on elections and messaging. She is the author of Competitive Elections and the American Voter, co-author of Campaigns on Elections, Rules, Reality, Strategy, and Choice, and also Democracy at Risk, How Political Choices Undermine Participation and What Can Be Done About it. She's also published numerous articles in the area of political communication, political behavior, and democratic theory.
She's very
There
good.
she is. Right.
Thank you.
And the last speaker today is Frances Fox Piven. She's Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the Graduate Center. Professor Piven writes about American politics with a focus on social movements from below, electoral politics, and the dynamic interplay between movements and elections. Professor Piven, I think, has written more books and articles than the rest of the panel combined. And among her books are Regulating the Poor, The Functions of Public Welfare, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed, Why They Fail, Why Americans Don't Vote, and also Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America. So just a few comments before I hand it over to the panel to kind of set the stage. You don't know, right? You should know that last night the results gave the Democratic Party control of the House of Representatives. Republicans increased their control of the Senate by 2 to 3 seats. Over 100 women were elected to the House of Representatives. We are going to see our first Native American woman member of Congress, 2 of them in fact. We're also going to see our first Muslim woman, 2 of them, right? We're also going to see our youngest woman ever elected to Congress from the New York delegation. There were also over 30 governor's races. And I just want, my favorite race that I was following last night was actually the 22nd state Senate district in New York, and that was because a CUNY alum, Andrew Bernardus, was running in that race, and he won. And so he's part of the Democratic wave, at least in New York State, that's going to be taking over control of the New York State Senate for the first time in 10 years. And that's especially exciting for, I think, us CUNY faculty to see a CUNY graduate run and win an election. So I'm excited to hear what our distinguished guests have to say, and I'm going to turn it over first to Professor Ford.
So I'm not distinguished, but and I'm not sure I have anything valuable to add. You should know that I'm a historical sort of scholar. That is to say that I tend to study change over time, meaning decades and sometimes centuries. So change over the last 24 hours is something, not something that I sort of draw emphasis from. But with that said, I would like to sort of start with a story and then sort of lay out a few of my own random observations to get us started and to get us thinking about a few things. So I was at a bar last week, and it was in DC, and I went down, I was doing research in DC, not just going to bars in DC, but I went to the bar and I'm sitting there and I'm reading, and normally people come up to me and sort of say, what are you reading, what's going on, you sort of talk, and because it's in DC, you sort of get in the conversation about politics. But for the longest time, no one spoke to me, and I looked down and I realized that I'm reading this book called Black Marxism. Right? And it looks like it sounds. It's a big book. It's a black book. And so here, the big black guy, big black book, Black Marxism, is at a wine bar in D.C. looking for a conversation around politics, and it's not forthcoming until Black Marxism comes up again. So correct that for a second. Until 2 white women walk into the bar. They sit next to me, and they're hilarious. Apparently they're at some kind of airline conference, and I'm listening because by this point there's no need to finish reading Black Marxism. And they're talking about using sort of the language of unions and working class politics, management. And they're complaining about how management is taking away their benefits. They're complaining about their working conditions. And so I'm like, okay, oh, this is good, right? And so then we start chatting about things, and the conversation is going well until one of them says, well, I support Trump. Now, usually, when I'm around sort of white people out and about and they say they're a Trump supporter, I just sort of say, ha, that's great. And sort of say, oh, sure, I completely understand. But this time I decided to engage a bit more. And what they basically said, despite this seeing the class consciousness that sort of started our interaction, despite their talking about the working conditions, they were drawn to this damn caravan. Now, again, on Facebook, when I'm in New York, everyone I know thinks this is the most insane thing that they've ever heard of in their entire life, sort of fascism run amok, a political ploy. But these women, again, sort of middle-class white women from Ohio, who seem to have sort of a working class consciousness, are somehow embracing this idea of protecting the borders, right? This is important. This is something nations do. Why shouldn't we do it? One of them said to me. And then we started talking about gender. And again, I thought, oh wow, Kavanaugh, right? You guys are going to be pissed off, aren't you? And they were like, what a waste of time that was. I was like, wow. And then they kept saying, yeah, you know what, so what? Some people, they get in trouble doing things, all men do it. And I'm sitting there, now this is not just the booze, but I'm actually sort of shocked. I'm sort of stunned by what I'm hearing because, in part, the change in discourse, just sort of going down the Northeast corridor a few places to DC to sort of hear this. And so eventually they leave, and then I return to Black Marxism, right? Whose insight, fundamental insight, right, is that we cannot abstract race from capitalism, right? That capitalism is embedded within racial structures. I was reminded of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the great historian, who talks about a meta-language of race when it comes to the politics of gender. And I'm sitting there watching, again, after I'm struggling with these concepts in Black Marxism, sort of race overwhelming all these other identities, right? Even after a robust working class consciousness, someone is talking about these two women are embracing enthusiastically someone who is an opponent to sort of, in my opinion, the working class. So, what did I think after I left that? Well, I was looking for this election for signs of two things. One, without going sort of all hillbilly elegy and stuff like that, but sort of how do we win them over? Right? What kind of frame do we use? What kind of argument can we use to win them over? And two, how can we defeat them? Right? So that after I leave you at the bar, you are in many ways a political opponent that I need to grapple with. And so how, as a part of the opposition, the resistance, right, how do I defeat you? And I think this election, again, from someone who studies sort of history and not good at sort of 24 hours analysis, but just for the last 24 hours, I learned two things in terms of how we can speak to people outside the Northeast corridor. And one is coming from the literature on American political development literature on policy feedbacks, right? That is, sort of policies can have political consequences. And so I was stunned by the importance of healthcare. Right? After 8 years of death panels and Obama killing every white kid in the country, right? With his health care proposal, Republicans are sort of saying, well, okay, it's not so bad. Okay, yeah, I was for it before I was against it, right? And people are sort of losing in I think, in a lot of areas because of the Republicans' anti-Obamacare stance. So how do we get there? Well, the literature tells us that if you have policies that are broad-based and sort of can unite people, it would be sort of hard to overturn, and people might become invested in those progressive policies. So I think, well, the first thing we can do on the left to woo working class women like that is perhaps offer a policy agenda that speaks to their needs. Offer them a policy agenda that sort of unites them in a material way with the sort of the least of us, right? Now, how the hell do you get there if you're out of power? Well, you have to first learn how to defeat them. And here the news is not so good. And that is, I was stunned when I looked at the exit polls for Georgia. And about 30 or so % of white women in Georgia voted for, what's her name? Yes, Abrams. 30%.
They voted for the black woman?
30%, only 30%.
30%.
Yes.
70% voted for Kemp.
Yes. Right? Again, who is in many ways, and maybe again it might just be just outrageous, right? And then go to Texas. 50% white women, over 50% of white women voted for Ted Cruz. He's an awful individual, right? Forget about his politics, right? And the same thing with DeSantis. And so I return back to those, the women at the bar, and I wonder again, if we are right in our theoretical approaches about race, sort of overwhelming class and gender are profound and accurate in this instance, what the hell do we do? Is our only option to let demography do its work? I'm not sure. I hope not. I don't think we should wait for population change in order to have Beto win Texas. I think that the lesson for me is that we're going to have a lot of mixed nights like last night if we continue to deal with if we sort of recognize the fundamental racial ordering of American society, then we have to acknowledge that that's going to persist for a while. However, if we have a radical policy agenda for working class folks, and we do whatever we can, perhaps on the state level in New York and other places, slowly but surely we can win enough of them. Enough of those two lovely women that I had drinks with at the bar, and eventually, hopefully, they will be one of us, and I don't have to worry about defeating them.
Now I'm really not happy to have to go second. That's but I have to push forward. And so when the idea of putting this panel together came up, I talked to Charles and Ina about, I had about 10 different things that I thought I really wanted to talk about, but of course I can't. And so we decided to narrow it down, and I'm going to talk about something pretty specific, and hopefully it's still interesting, and that is what I predicted that using models like Charles's, that the Republicans would lose control of the House, and thought about trying to project what the new leadership, not the Pelosi level speaker leadership, but the leadership on committees would look like under a Democratic Congress, and what that might mean for the coming 2 years. And so, let's see. So anyway, what the midterms mean for House committee leadership. It's very dry compared to Michael's story about DC bars, but okay.
And a bar.
So just for, this is going to do double duty. This might show up, there's a few students of mine in the room. It might show up in class on next week, but just so everyone knows, these are the standing committees of Congress, and then the asterisk is because the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence is, in essence, a standing committee, but they give us a different name. So these are all the different committees that do most of the work in the House of Representatives. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, this morning there was this article, I don't know if you can read the title, in the Wall Street Journal called "Meet the New Agenda Setters in the House," and that's exactly what I was kind of thinking about when I thought of this talk, and that is there's two main reasons that we think the chairs of committees are important, and both of those have to do with the concept of agenda setting, and this is the idea that the majority party in the House of Representatives in particular, even more so than in the Senate, really gets to decide what the issues that Congress is going to be working on. And the minority party has almost no say. And we've noticed that over the last 2 years, if you're wondering, well, how come no one's talking about minimum wage, or how come no one's talking about, a lot of these issues. So agenda setting, I think, is one of the key things that's going to be affected by this change in majority leadership. And there's kind of two specific subsets. We could talk about legislative agenda setting, and I'm going to sort of predict that what the Democrats are going to want to do is they're going to want to pick issues that highlight things that the public thinks that they do well, right? You want to start talking about things that the public associates with Democrats. Healthcare would be an obvious one there, but we'll talk about some others. And then secondly, another thing that's going to set the agenda for Congress and for the news media is what kind of oversight activities. And so for some of the students who might not be aware, because we haven't talked about it in class yet, oversight here doesn't mean, oh, I overlooked this. It means checking up on the executive branch and seeing if the policies that Congress passed are being carried out or executed by Congress or by the executive in the way that Congress intended. And to do that, they can call members of the executive branch in to testify and answer questions before Congress. So that's what we mean by oversight. Okay, so a little bit about how I predicted, which turns out not to be too controversial, which are the Democrats who are going to be the chairs in the new Congress. So this is what the Democratic Party has as their criterion for how chairs are selected. So notice this part. So length of service on committee. In the old days, this was sacrosanct. You would say it was, the seniority principle. Now it's not so sacrosanct. It's just one of several factors. Secondly, the Democratic Party in particular, not necessarily the Republican Party, says that they explicitly want to take into account the diversity of all the people who just got elected. There's more women now, more people of color. And so theoretically, they're going to take that into account as well when they're picking the chairs of the committees. And then finally, degree of commitment to the Democratic agenda. So in the old days, it was possible that some conservative Southerner who'd been sitting on the committee forever would get to become chair, even though he was more conservative than everyone else in the Democratic caucus. Now the Democrats don't want to do that anymore, or for a while now. And so they take into account how loyal you are to the agenda. Okay. So I'm going to talk about two sets of changes. One is, we can use this fancy term, descriptive representation. All right, so our members of Congress provide us with representation. Descriptive representation means that one of the things they're representing is, let's say, demographic characteristics. And then secondly, we can talk about substantive representation, which we associate with things like policies and the policy preferences of the constituents. But really, both of these there's an interaction between them. They're not mutually exclusive ideas. So in terms of substantive representation, again, you can divide into legislative representation and oversight representation. All right. Now for the fun part. Descriptive representation. So here is, in one picture, all of the current chairs of the House before the election. And I'm hoping this slide shows up pretty well. So just kind of get an overview there. And then in 1 second, I'm going to click the clicker, and you're going to see the pictures of the people who we're 95% sure will be the chairs of the same committees. They're overlapping on the same spots. And then just to emphasize this point, I'm going to click back. forth a little bit here. So, what differences do people are people noticing in these two sets of pictures?
Race, gender.
More women, more people of color. That's definitely true. So, and we're going to talk about some others, but just in terms of gender. So let's see if I can see here. The Republican chairs, only 10% of them are women, and it's projected that about almost 30% of the Democratic chairs are going to be women. In terms of ethnicity, 0 non-white members, chairs in the 115th Congress, and it's projected about 33% or a third of the Democrats' chairs are going to be people of color. Religion, interestingly, which you probably could tell, obviously, from that last the photos, but think about people like Gerald Nadler, right here in New York, is going to become chair of the Judiciary Committee, and several other chairs. So going from 0% Jewish to almost a third Jewish, and then Protestant is significantly reduced in order to kind of fit in some religious diversity. What about region? This is interesting too. Not too surprisingly, this emphasizes what we know. The Republican Party is the party that's rooted in the South now. And so 62% of their chairs were from southern states. Now in the new Congress, that's going to be less than 30%. And who's replacing them? Well, the best region for Democrats last night was the Northeast, and that's going to be reflected also in the new chairs, with about 33%, 3 times as many chairs from the Northeast. And interestingly, the West as well, not so much from the Midwest. Oops, going the wrong way. And the Republican Party and the Democratic Party also differ very much in terms of not region, but size of place or population density, or we could say urban versus rural, right? The Democratic Party in Congress, particularly in the House, is surprisingly very, very urban, and particularly the members from those urban areas get reelected so frequently that they benefit on that seniority angle, and they're going to end up being a lot of our chairs in the new Congress. Whereas you can see here, in the Republican Congress, more rural or small suburbs. Okay, now a few words about substantive representation, legislation, and oversight. What I want to argue briefly is strategic context, I think, is going to affect Democrats behaving in a way that Republicans weren't necessarily behaving. I think we're going to see some changes in sort of the strategic behavior of the two parties. And why is that? Well, because we've gone from a situation where one party had control of House, Senate, and presidency to one situation of divided government, split control. Why would that make a difference? Well, the way I see it, the Republicans were doing things like trying to repeal Obamacare, like pushing forward a tax cut that had less than majority support. And that's not really smart if you want to win elections. So to me, that says they made a strategic calculation that you only get this level of power very infrequently, and so while you have it, you're going to use it and to enact your agenda. And so that was more important to them than appealing to the moderate voter. Will Democrats be doing the same thing? Well, there's little chance that the Democratic policies are actually going to be able to become law, and they know that with a Republican president who can veto them or a Republican Senate that can filibuster them. So then they have to think about, well, are we going to be bipartisan? Certainly we hear a lot of talk about that. I think Nancy Pelosi's speech today at least head faked in that direction. We're willing to meet the president on certain issues. Whether she really believes that is a different issue, and I'm in fact going to argue that she doesn't, because I think she is fairly strategic. Because just the end of this phrase is, if, let's say, they pass an infrastructure bill, who's that going to help more, Democrats or President Trump? It's probably going to help President Trump be able to use that in his election presentation of himself in 2020. So I don't think they want to do that in the same way that Mitch McConnell openly said our #1 goal as Republicans is to prevent Obama from becoming a 2-term president. That's what the Democrats' goal is now, so they don't want to help Trump. So what are they going to do? Their actions are going to be actions that are essentially futile legislatively, and it's going to be to make a point. Like I said before, they're going to want to bring up issues that are popular, that people associate with Democrats and think Democrats can do a good job on, in order to kind of put Republicans in a bind. You know, they have to come out against something that's very popular. That's going to be the goal of the legislative agenda, in my view. So highlight policy issues favorable to Democrats, and in terms of oversight, highlight oversight topics that are going to be dangerous and damaging for Trump. Okay? They have to be a little more careful there, but I think that's what we're going to see. Okay. Now, all of you are probably familiar with, or it's very easy to kind of Google and figure out that there's some big committees that everyone's talking about. I've kind of picked more kind of second-tier committees that might not be as obvious. People know Ways and Means is important. The Permanent Select Intelligence Committee that's doing the Russian investigation is important. So they're not on my list here. So you can read about them elsewhere. So let's just think about these 3 committees. The Education and Workforce Committee works on stuff with higher education, which is important to all of us in this room. Also job training, worker rights, worker pay and benefits. Judiciary Committee, which deals with anything that is related to law and order, civil liberties, the courts. And then finally, the Financial Services Committee, that's with banking, housing, insurance, securities, monetary policy, and international finance. So what I want to do now, so we talked about descriptive representation. If we talk about substantive representation, one manifestation of that is ideology. So this chart is a little bit light on the screen, but if you look closely, you can see there's kind of 2 blobs there. And what this is a left-right ideological continuum with liberals on the left-hand side and conservatives on the right-hand side. And it's a histogram. It tells you how many members of Congress are at each point on that scale. And what you see is all of the Democrats are on the left-hand side of the scale, and there's a few extremists at the end, and then a lot of sort of somewhat liberal, and then a few moderates at the other end, on the other tail, and then conservatives sort of the same thing, although they're more blocky, less normally distributed. Okay, so just this is a little bit of background. So what about, let's take a look at that Education and Workforce Committee. And you see, I'll say in a moment why the workforce is in quotation marks. So this, so the old chair, the exiting chair is Virginia Fox from North Carolina, and she was more conservative than 90% of the House. Right? Remember, your loyalty to the agenda is what gets you to be chairs of these committees. And she's going to be replaced by Bobby Scott, an African-American from Virginia. And he has been more liberal than 87% of the House. Okay, so that's going to be a big swing in terms of their policy preferences. More specifically, what was Fox working on? Her top priorities were things like deregulating college education, allowing more for-profit college